Good afternoon, or perhaps good morning for you. Today's talk is about Thucydides. He is, as he described his own work, a possession for all time. We could spend many classes talking about his work because it has extraordinary depth and sophistication. As this is a course on war, we're going to focus on the most salient aspects of that from his treatment. These are, in the first place, the origins of war. As some of you may know, Thucydides is generally credited with making the distinction between the underlying and immediate causes of war, and for focusing more on the underlying causes of war, very different from accounts of wars up until his time. The second issue is why wars escalate, why they often go beyond what their initiators had intended. The principal account of this has to do with loss of control. And that loss of control can be to one's own public opinion, military forces, or allies, problems you will recognize that we still confront. His third focus on war is its consequences. And Thucydides is more interested in the consequences for the countries who fight them than he is of the overall society or system. However, he does have some thoughts on that subject as well. He's, again, probably the first student of war to look at the interaction between what goes on in the conduct of a war and how it affects the domestic politics and indeed the domestic structure of the society that is fighting it. And finally, we come to the question of after the spears stop jabbing and the swords stop slashing, how do we rebuild order in the aftermath of very destructive, large-scale conflicts? In the time allotted to me for this talk, I doubt I will be able to get beyond the first question, but I hope that my answer to that suggests to you just how complex these issues are and ways in which you need to read Thucydides to tease them out. And let's start with Thucydides' text. But perhaps some of you are capable of reading ancient Greek, and if so, you will resonate to what I have to say. The rest of you will be reading it in translation, and I don't care what language you read it in your native tongue if there's a good translation available. There's a serious issue in translating Thucydides, in part because he adopts a sophist mode of presentation. This is interesting because he and Plato both dislike sophism and reject relativism of values, and also the use of rhetoric for narrow either political or commercial purposes. But sophist techniques of argument appeal to him, and with good reason. So, in contrast to the way in which we construct arguments, Thucydides doesn't tell us at the outset what he's going to argue, doesn't present an overview of his case, doesn't tell us how he's going to make it in the course of his narrative. Rather, sophists attempt to draw you in, to create contradictions that careful listeners or readers see and worry about, and make some attempt to resolve. There are layers of these conflicts in Thucydides. And what sophists try to do, and Thucydides as well, is to lead you to a judgment that you think is yours, not the author's. Because ideas that you think you've created, you'll be much more attached to than those that are told or seemingly sold to you by others. The nature of the Greek language and Thucydides' use of it facilitates this task. Greek sentences and Greek language is set up to encourage men de either or clauses in a sentence in which the one part is in tension with the other. Thucydides does this in sentences. He does it in what we would call paragraphs. Remember, when he was writing, everything was just run together. There were no separations between even words in some cases, and certainly not sentences, paragraphs, and books. And he does it in books, and books are, of course, later constructs. He didn't organize it that way, but text lends itself to that kind of organization. So you'll see when we discuss the origins of the war that he begins by telling us in Book 1, chapter 23, line 6, that it was the rise to power of Athens and the fear it inspired in others that led to the Peloponnesian War. And realists, of course, take that at face value, which in a sophist argument you never do. When you read the rest of Book 1, you will see, and I'll discuss this in due course, that Thucydides presents a case that undercuts entirely this famous sentence for his explanation of war. So this is one of the sharpest tensions in the book. It's up front in Book 1, and it leads us to ask why and to look for a deeper explanation. So translations of Thucydides are difficult because of the structure of the book, but also because of Greek phrases and words, and we'll come to this in the course of the argument. Now, the first thing I'd like to do in making the substantive argument is to disassociate myself from realist readings of Thucydides. I want to argue that they should be dismissed out of hand because they're utterly superficial. They often simply cherry pick the odd quote or a dialogue, take it out of context, and read it in terms of 20th century understandings of politics. This is not how you read a sophisticated text, whether it's an ancient Greek text or a 19th or 20th century text by a well-known and thoughtful writer, especially a philosopher. Now, the standard realist argument is that it was, as Thucydides states, the rise of Athenian power that threatened the Spartans and led to war. This has also been cited as the basis for something in international relations called power transition theory, which uses the Peloponnesian War as the first example of a phenomenon in which major wars are the result of conflicts between rising powers and existing dominant powers. Either the rising power feels strong enough to flex its muscles and go to war, or the dominant power fears that at some point it will, so it starts a preventive war before that can happen. There's no evidence for this whatsoever in the Peloponnesian War, and I must say, no evidence for it throughout history, but that's another matter. Now, when we read the first book of Thucydides, we have debates both in Athens and in Sparta, and the debates in Sparta, or the speeches, are initially by Athenian representatives who happen to be there when the Spartans are considering war, and then by Spartan allies, notably Corinth, encouraging the Spartans to go to war. And then we have an actual debate between King Archidamus, who might be called, in very loose terms, the head of the peace party, and the ephor Stephanolades, who speaks for those who want to go to war. It's very interesting when you read these speeches. The Archidamus speech is long, complex. There are reasoned arguments. He suggests that Spartans tend to undervalue the power of Athens, that if Sparta starts a war, it might be one it passes on to its children. The Athenians are very difficult to defeat because they're a naval power. They can basically withdraw behind their walls, thumb their noses at Sparta, and as Sparta has no fleet, there's little it can do, and it can't really buy a fleet because it's a very poor power, it's almost living in a subsistence manner on the labor of its slaves. Archidamus thus urges caution, and he urges caution because he recognizes the military power and economic power of Athens. Stephanolades brushes all of this aside. He says, we have good allies, they've been offended, we need to support them. Basically, we'll lose face if we don't. He appeals to the emotions rather than to the mind. And these young Spartans rally behind them. The vote is overwhelmingly in favor of war. Archidamus expects that the Spartans will simply march into Attica, the home territory of Athens. The Athenians will come out from behind their walls. A standard hoplite confrontation will take place, and as everybody expects, the Spartans, being the best army around, will win. They'll march home to celebrate their victory. There'll be a very short war. So what we find is that the people who are most intent on going to war have no fear whatsoever of Athenian military power. It's the very reverse of what Thucydides says initially in his first declarative sentence. And why is this so? Well, part of the answer I've explained has to do with creating these tensions and leading you to think through what way we might combine them to a deeper level of understanding. Now, if we look at the famous 123.6, where he says, truest cause of the war, the alisthete prophesis, and that it was inevitable and anche, we find, if we unpack these Greek words, we come to a different meaning than you usually find in the several prominent English translations of Thucydides. And the first of these truest causes, that is a prophesis. A prophesis is an interesting word in Greek. It has two very different origins. The first comes from the Ionian physicians. Prophysis was the final stage of a disease where the patient either succumbed and died or lived through the crisis and then healed and became better. So it's the crisis stage. And what Thucydides is talking about here are the immediate causes of war. But there's something else. The prophysis, and this is really the significant aspect of it, also developed in the Athenian law courts. And if you made an argument, or somebody made an argument for you in the courts, you always attempted to justify your behavior as consistent with accepted ethical practices. So the prophysis, this justification, may or may not have had anything to do with what your real motives are. But in the court, to win your case, you need to make it appear that you were acting in good faith and for proper motives. When we look at the famous Thucydides sentence this way, he's telling us that both sides are making arguments explaining why war broke out. That the Spartans did a better job of it, were more convincing, and more people in Greece thought Athens responsible for the war than for Sparta. So if we look at it as a kind of public relations battle, but then look beneath the surface to find the real explanations for the war, part of it has to do with the Spartan sense of insecurity. Indeed, the rise to power of Athens threatened Sparta, but not Sparta's security. It wasn't a physical threat that Athens posed. Spartan self-esteem, Spartan identity, everything about Spartan society rested on the premise that the Spartans were the best soldiers in Greece. Their long string of victories made them proud and defined who they were. What's happening is Athens is not only becoming powerful, it's becoming rich. It's spending its money glorifying its cities. It's winning respect throughout Greece because of these activities, because of its trade, chasing pirates from the seas, opening its markets and courts to people all over Greece to come and trade and do business and be fairly treated. Young people are emulating Athens, and they describe Sparta as archaeotropic, as something that's representing a past life which we no longer have any interest in. It's utterly passé. So Sparta is being basically bypassed by a change in values that emphasizes culture, wealth, and display. That stuck in the Spartans' craw. They went to war, and Sthenelaidas was able to mobilize such support for it because it appealed to the Spartan sense of self-esteem. And here, if we turn to Plato and Aristotle, the ancient Greeks had a richer understanding of the human mind than moderns do. There were three parts, three fundamental drives that human beings had. It was appetite. Appetite is very much the same. The Greeks understood it as we do. Then there was something called thumos, in English Thumos, often badly translated as spirit. I don't have a better translation to offer, but spirit will do. And it rests on a understanding that human beings everywhere want to feel good about themselves. That self-esteem is a fundamental human value, often in conflict with appetite, and we do things generally to preference spirit over appetite. Very simple. You're at a meal, you don't start eating until everybody is served. It's polite, but it's also a matter of self-esteem, of living up to the expected conventions of your society. But normally the way you achieve this, the Greeks would describe, and I think it applies everywhere, is by excelling in activities valued by your peer group and your society. By winning the approbation of others because of your performance, you in turn feel good about yourself. And the Spartans were feeling very bad about themselves because of this increasing marginalization and almost becoming not quite a laughingstock, but being passed by Athens and other city-states that were now emulating it rather than looking up to Sparta. So this is an important underlying cause of the war. If we now turn to immediate causes, it's perfectly clear that miscalculation figures in prominently at every level of escalation. As you know from reading this book 1, the war begins as a civil war in this tiny polis of Epidamnus, which is on the Adriatic coast somewhere in today's probably Croatia, and pits, as it often did in ancient Greek, democrats against aristocrats. The Democrats were on the losing side. People seek to expand the conflict if they're losing to try to offset and get more power from outsiders. So they went to Corcyra, seeking help. Corcyra is a democracy and has a big fleet. The Corcyrans have a long-standing dispute with Corinth. Epidamnus is a Corinthian colony. By helping the Democrats, they're going to wean a Corinthian colony away from its mother city to them. So they get involved. The Corinthians see red, send their fleet after the Corcyrans. The Corcyrans don't want to confront Corinth, which is the second most powerful state in that part of Greece. So they go seeking support from Athens. And the Corcyrans make an argument that if Athens comes to their support, they will ally the first and third largest fleet in Greece, and they will become unbeatable, even if it starts a war with Sparta. And in fact, what happens at every step of this miscalculation, by coming to the support of another one of these states, leaders are thinking they will deter the adversary, but in fact all it does is arouse the adversary, and conflict escalates until finally the Spartans and the Athenians are at war. So Pericles is part of a long chain of leaders who make a miscalculation. Now, why do the Athenians listen to the Corcyrans who urge them to come to their support, and spurn the Corinthians who ask them to stay neutral? And here too we come to an underlying cause of war. These two speeches are very interesting. The Corcyran speech uses the language of self-interest, and it uses lots of verbs and nouns that are taken from commercial exchange, which is increasingly prominent in Greece and in Athens. The Corcyrans are asking the Athenians to frame this matter as one of pure self-interest, and to think of it strategically, how they'll benefit by having Corcyra as an ally. The Corinthians come in and make a very different kind of speech, built around the stem dik, or the word dike, which means justice, which I think they use something like 24 times in various forms in the course of the speech. And they're making a traditional argument. Relations among people and city-states in Greece are based on mutual respect and reciprocity. The Corinthians describe how when Sparta and allies considered going to war against Athens on a prior occasion, the Corinthians said this isn't a smart idea and dissuaded them. So Athens owes Corinth. And much of Greek relationships are built on this kind of reciprocity, gift giving. Somebody gives you a gift, you accept it, that creates a relationship, and you in turn have to reframe how you think of the gift giver. With commercial exchange, all of this begins to end, because when you can put a monetary value on things, you can have purely equal exchanges. And what's exchanged doesn't carry stories, it doesn't create relationships, it's simply a matter of interest. So the Corinthians use the old language, and the Athenians decide to take themselves out of traditional practices and to accept the Corcyran argument. Interestingly, the Athenians, at the time the war began in 431, were considered a hegemon. And hegemonia is the Greek root for our word hegemon, but it had a very different meaning. Our meaning hegemon is the top dog who's able to tell others what to do. Hegemonia in ancient Greece was an honorific. It was a recognition that you had done extraordinary deeds for the community as a whole. And Athens was a hegemon, as was Sparta, because it had taken the lead in repelling the Persian invasions. It had liberated 150 city-states after defeating the Persians at the Battle of Salamis and subsequently pushing them back to Persia. It, I noted earlier, had cleared the seas of pirates. It established a currency that was maintained in its value. It enabled others to get wealthy as well and trade. So for all of these reasons, Athens was a hegemon, which meant it was recognized as a leader. But to lead, it meant you had to lead on behalf of the community. You couldn't assert your self-interest at the expense of the community. To do that, you become a tyrant. And a tyrant is an Anatolian word, originally in Lydia, that described leaders who acted solely for their own advantage, often at the expense of the people over whom they ruled. And the Athenian alliance, we see in the course of the book, goes from being a hegemonia, Athens becomes an archaic, and it becomes the head of an empire, relies now on fear rather than persuasion. Why does this happen? Because if you're the head of a community, you have to limit your own goals and the means by which they're achieved. You have to take others' interests into account. You have to formulate your interest in terms of the community. The Athenians increasingly take themselves outside of it, and in the process create the conditions of their own defeat, which is, of course, another story and another lecture. But here, let me conclude by suggesting that this is a tale of modernity, that there's a kind of proto-enlightenment that takes place in Athens, associated with cultural and intellectual flourishing and wealth as a result of both conquest and trade. It had profound consequences on how people framed their interests. Increasingly, both individuals and the polis of Athens thought of themselves as autonomous, egoistic individuals with devastating consequences. And this is a story I think, that could be told today. And it's one of the many reasons why Thucydides' text is indeed a possession for all time. Thank you.